As Super Tuesday looms, Democrats face a reckoning, and the presidential race begins a new political season.
Along the way, it has featured 28 candidates who made up the largest and most diverse slate in history. The surge of Senator Bernie Sanders has rattled the Democratic establishment.
Our campaign is not just about beating Trump, it is about transforming this country.
With a populist appeal that has electrified younger and liberal voters.
We took a gut punch in Iowa.
Former Vice President Joe Biden now needs a strong showing in South Carolina to keep his bid alive. Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senator Elizabeth Warren continue to fight on.
Are you in this fight with me? Let's do this.
As does former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
We feel encouraged. We're definitely getting traction.
But there is a wild card.
Jobs creator, leader, problem solver.
Can former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, spending millions, assert himself as the leading alternative to Sanders? On Super Tuesday, March 3rd, we may find out when voters from 14 states and one territory make their choice. From Alabama to Maine, Texas to Minnesota to California, which is poised to deliver a bevy of delegates. All told, more than 1,300 delegates are up for grabs. Careers are on the line.
Are you going to win?
Yes.
Debates are as heated as ever.
This is about the future.
As Democrats campaign to be the party's standard bearer.
This is Washington Week. Once again from Washington, moderator Robert Costa.
Welcome to this special edition of Washington Week. Joining me at the table, Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. And from San Francisco, Marisa Lagos, politics correspondent and co-host of the Political Breakdown podcast at KQED, San Francisco's PBS station. And from Dallas, Texas, Abby Livingston, Washington bureau chief for the Texas Tribune. Marisa, California, it is the prize on Super Tuesday. Is Senator Sanders poised to win there? And if so, why?
Well, if we believe polling, then absolutely. Recent polls have him as much as 20 points ahead of Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. I think the real question here, you mentioned the delegate count. We're talking 415 delegates up for grabs on Tuesday, almost half of what somebody needs to get the nomination. And Sanders, like elsewhere, is doing very well, especially with Latino voters, but really across the board, and especially among independents in this state. And that's really important. We have more no-party preference voters in California than we have Republican registered voters, about 25% of the electorate, a little more at this point. And they are breaking for Sanders, very much so. And I think that in a lot of ways, the question really becomes who else will get any delegates, given the fact that you got to get 15% statewide or in one of these 53 congressional districts to even be in the game. Marisa, you said they're trending towards Sanders a little bit. What do we know at this point about the early vote, the mail-in vote? Yeah, it's really interesting. We have seen a much sort of slower trickle of ballots come in than in years past. There were some 16 million ballots sent out. Around 18% of those have come back, same around that number in terms of the Democratic ballots. And so it seems like people have been really holding on and waiting to vote. I mean, a few weeks ago, voting experts were saying some 40% of the electorate may have weighed in by this point, or at least by Monday. That is not proving to be the case so far. It certainly seems like Republicans are happy to send in their ballot. Much different question there, right? But Democrats seems like they wanted to know what was happening in Nevada, what happened in these debates, and clearly what's going to happen this weekend in South Carolina potentially could change the trajectory here in California as well. And what about in Texas, Abby? Could what happens in South Carolina change what happens in Texas? You look at Vice President Biden, based on recent polls in Texas, he seems to be creeping up there behind Senator Sanders.
I think it absolutely could have an impact on Texas, and I don't think I would have said that 3 weeks ago. You've got to remember, early voting ended today, and it's been going on for almost 2 weeks. And so normally you would expect folks to be rushing to the polls, and usually if the Democratic primary is even relevant in Texas by its primary day, it's a binary choice. What I am finding anecdotally on the ground when I talk to folks is there's either people who are all in for Bernie Sanders or they are completely paralyzed. They don't know who the most electable person is. And I don't think that is an answerable question. And so it's almost psychologically individuals are waiting to, they're afraid of making the wrong choice, so they're waiting until Election Day to cast their ballots.
Abby, has Mayor Bloomberg had a presence in Texas?
On the television and in direct mail, absolutely. And he's been in and out of the state. But it is fascinating, and it's a reminder how not everyone is a political junkie. And when I landed in Texas, there was a real unawareness that Mayor Bloomberg maybe didn't have a great debate appearance. And there's a real sense that he's a formidable candidate. His advertising has worked. And so I actually had a friend say she voted for Bloomberg because she thought he was the most electable, and she didn't really feel good about it. Her heart wasn't in it, but that was her perception.
Abby, Marisa, stay with us. When you look at the Super Tuesday map, Yamiche, you have California and Texas, big important states, but you have Arkansas, North Carolina, Mississippi. It's not just South Carolina where voters who are of color are going to have a real say over the Democratic nominee. And many of the voters are also going this weekend to Selma, Alabama.
Well, I also think it's the Super Tuesday that we've seen, the fact that you had states move up their primaries to try to have more of a say. California was a big one. Bernie Sanders, I remember being on the bus when Bernie Sanders lost California. They were very angry because the AP had already called the election for Hillary Clinton. He felt like that depressed a lot of his voters. So what we're seeing now are candidates really looking at this landscape and saying, this is what America looks like. If I can do well on Super Tuesday, I can go forward. And that means that you have to really look at candidates like Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, who are going to have to likely make hard decisions coming after Super Tuesday. And of course, there's Joe Biden, who feels like he's the person who can win. And he told me that he thinks that this is going to ultimately come down to him and Bernie Sanders. But Michael Bloomberg is the X effect. And I'm not sure we quite understand the effect that Michael Bloomberg is going to have until people really start casting their ballots.
Peter, Mississippi, just my apologies, is not a Super Tuesday state. Alabama is a Super Tuesday state. But you look at Vice President Biden, your paper had an excellent report about how the VP may not be prepared to go on to some of these Super Tuesday states in terms of infrastructure.
Well, you heard Jeff say right there, he has spent his entire week in South Carolina. He has spent his entire campaign fortune, basically, in South Carolina. He moved a lot of money around, and he's not necessarily competing yet for Super Tuesday. He only gets to compete there if he gets that big bounce out of South Carolina. It's hard to put together an organization, given that, but it is possible to build on that momentum, potentially, in some of these states. You would have thought that had been the opposite, right? You would have thought that of all people, Joe Biden would be the one playing across the map. He was the establishment favorite. He was the front runner through much of last year, and yet he's now playing from behind.
Marisa, when you're talking to voters in California, which issues are top of mind? Climate change, health care, immigration?
I would say healthcare and climate change are really what are pushing people. You know, this last year was literally the first time we've seen in statewide polls that climate change was up there at the top. It seems like immigration is still sort of animating Republicans in recent polls more than Democrats, but it's certainly an issue. I think that in a lot of ways in California, this very deep blue state with such a huge immigrant population, especially from, South America, Central America, and Mexico, that a lot of that is sort of anti-Trump sentiment, not necessarily pushing these candidates for their plans. Healthcare is definitely top of mind. The way it is, I think, nationally, I think this is really, in a state like this where we really embrace the Affordable Care Act and have really expanded healthcare aggressively, I think a lot of it is a question of sort of philosophically, where do people want to go moving forward? But certainly climate change is an issue, although I'll say it doesn't seem to be the one motivating factor. You know, I think we've heard across the country this question of electability. It does seem like in the primary, Democrats really feel like they're trying to pick the right horse that they think can beat Trump. And so while those are issues that are talked about a lot, it's not as if you saw the fact that Tom Steyer, for example, a Californian, making that the centerpiece of his campaign, that really, bumped him up in the polls or got people excited about him.
Abby, when you look at the news out of another Super Tuesday state on Friday, Virginia, Senator Tim Kaine got behind Vice President Biden. There's talk that former Governor McAuliffe in Virginia may get behind Biden. When you're in there in Texas, is there concern about what Senator Sanders could mean down ballot for Texas Democrats? And will there be a move in the coming days to get behind Biden or Bloomberg?
It's not a concern. It's a full-blown panic among many office holders in the state. There are no figures in Texas on the scale outside of possibly former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who are a Terry McAuliffe or a Tim Kaine. But you've got a bunch of members of Congress and a bunch of state legislators who have already endorsed Joe Biden. It's not blanket, but that is the most prominent folks. And they know how to get the vote out in their primary, in their districts. And so they've been doing that for weeks, if not months. And they are very worried about what Senator Sanders will do. And one of the main reasons is because the state House of Representatives is possibly in play, and that could set the table for the rest of the decade and the party building when it comes to redistricting.
When you look at other Super Tuesday states, is this a moment for people to think about dropping out, Peter? If you lose your own home state, Senator Klobuchar in Minnesota, Senator Warren in Massachusetts.
Yeah, this is a winnowing day. This is a day that decides who's going into the final rounds. And there are these other storylines that are playing out in Minnesota, in Massachusetts in particular. If you don't win your home state, there's no point in going on for either of those candidates, you would think. I shouldn't presume. But the question about Super Tuesday is who does take on Senator Sanders? Yes, assuming he comes out of that with the most delegates, is there a single contender take that on? Does it become Bloomberg? Does it become Biden? Buttigieg, outside chance, Klobuchar. But we're seeing a repeat in a way of 4 years ago, right? Donald Trump was not seen at the beginning as the dominant force that he became, and there was a chance, perhaps, early on for his contenders to take him down if there had been a one-on-one contest. He was winning 20, 30% of the vote in these Republican states. By the time it got to be a one-on-one contest, it was too late. He had built up too much momentum. The question here for the Democrats is, are they going to consolidate around one person to take on Senator Sanders, or is, in fact, Senator Sanders going to continue to exploit the divisions among the moderates?
Senator Warren faces a choice as well.
Senator Warren faces a choice, back to the idea of possibly losing her home state. I think the word that Abby's using is panic, and I think that that's such a good word to use when you talk to Democrats who are establishment Democrats. They say first that they are scared to have a Democratic socialist at the top of the ticket because they think that that's going to hurt the House and hurt their chances to be able to have down-ballot success. They also said that they changed the rules for Senator Sanders and that now he might be using that against them if he doesn't end up with all the delegates he needs to secure the nomination outright. They're worried that now he has this following that is really, really emotionally attached to Bernie Sanders in a way that other candidates don't have their supporters. I would say anecdotally, based on my reporting, they're very, very worried that Senator Sanders could be unstoppable.
Very quickly, Marisa, I know I'm a political junkie, but I'm asking this seriously. Are voters in California, are they talking about a possible contested convention and what it could mean?
I think it's early yet, but I will say, it is a very different situation here. Obviously, we have establishment Democrats, but Speaker Pelosi, Governor Gavin Newsom, Senator Kamala Harris, none of them have endorsed since Kamala Harris dropped out of the race. And you really see a wide split among elected officials here in terms of who they have endorsed. Bloomberg came in, got a lot of mayors, a lot of folks, but there is a wide split. And I wouldn't say quite the level of panic here, probably because we have so many safe House districts for Democrats, although I will note there are 4 districts that Republicans are targeting that Dems flipped in 2018, and the GOP would really like to get them back.
And Abby, quickly, Speaker Pelosi said this week she would back Senator Sanders if he was the nominee, and she'll help other members navigate that whole scene.
That is vintage Nancy Pelosi, and I'm sure she's got her eye on the gavel, and that is what she's worried about, and she's trying to keep this party together.